Good evening. My name is Christoph Cortez, and I am doing my concept diagram on how biology, culture, and environment influence undernutrition. So, between the three factors, culture, environment, and biology, that affect undernutrition, even those three I split up into two different categories. While biology is an independent variable in the grand scheme of things, it is also drastically affected by the biology of your family. So in and of itself, it's also kind of going to be a dependent variable. So the true independent variables are going to be culture and environment. Now you'll notice that under each of the three categories, I also put a kind of theme. So basically, culture's theme is dietary practices. That's most of what affects undernutrition. For environment, its basic theme is going to be sanitation, and then in biology, it all relies on predisposition. So when we look at culture, the three things that culture affects that end up affecting undernutrition are access to food, education, and culture practices. So access to food is going to be one that involves the access in terms of dietary practices. So that is where the whole theme comes into culture. What kind of practices does that culture have? For example, nomadism would have a harder time having access to meat and livestock. Now, when it comes to things like education, we mostly look at education on nutrition. So if a society or an individual has a lack of education or lack of access to education on nutrition, they're likely not going to have a very robust nutrient diet. And then when it comes to cultural practices, again, this kind of ties back into the access of food and back onto dietary practices. But certain religions, for example, you might not be able to eat pork or eat certain food groups depending on what religion you practice or what culture you're a part of. Now, if you guys notice, access to food is also shared together with environment, and that kind of relays us over to that theme. So environment's entire theme is, again, going to be sanitation. So based on its sanitation, access to food and drinking water quality have a huge impact on whether or not that individual is going to have adequate nutrition. So when it comes to the environment, it also goes to access to food. In terms of income, its access to food is going to be limited on whether or not its income is going to allow for that. Family employment, again, ties back into income. And last but not least, the entire hygiene. So basically whether or not foods can be sanitized enough to eat. For example, your access to vegetation is going to be highly limited if you don't have the adequate amount of cleaning utensils to be able to clean vegetables, such as tomatoes especially, foods that are really going to be dirty coming into a household. When we go to the other side, we find our other variable, which is going to be biology, our last quote-unquote independent variable. And again, the theme here is going to be predisposition. So your ability to process foods, your adaptation, and your predetermined health factors are going to be all the dependent factors that are going to affect nutrition. So your ability to process foods, again, that comes from your biology. Your ability that comes from your family that's passed down, and whether or not you're able to process certain foods. Your adaptation to certain foods. And this kind of ties back a little to culture, but it's mostly going to be biological still. This is going to determine whether or not you're able to adapt to certain food groups, whether your biological history is more adept to being able to eat one food group over the other, and whether or not what you have access to is going to be adequate for what you need. And then last but not least, predetermined health factors. So when we come to predetermined health factors, again, ties back into, for example, if someone has a celiac disease or someone is lactose intolerant, ties back into the entire theme of predisposition. So whether or not someone is able to ingest certain foods is going to determine not only whether or not they have access to those foods, but whether or not they are able to actually eat them. So if they only have access to foods that they are not able to eat, at the end of the day, they're still going to be undernourished. So, grand scheme of things, we have our three big variables: culture, environment, and biology. And the dependent variables that come up with them from culture stems off cultural practices, education, and access to food. Then on the environment side, the dependent variables are going to be access to food, family employment, income, and drinking water quality. And then last but not least, on the biology front, we have the dependent variables of ability to process foods, adaptation, and predetermined health factors.